Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. After a very intense and long day of having insights into the institutional frameworks of Scholar at Risk and other very impressive enterprises that serve people in need in general. Now it's our turn to turn your attention to something more individual and something much more intimate. Although I find it a bit challenging to run a very intimate talk in such a spacious place, anyway, we'll do our best. Let me introduce the person who I'm honored to be interviewing today, talking to, Dr. Sreten Ugričić, a philosopher, person of many talents, who left the country, Serbia, after having the very successful professional career as a journalist, as a head of the National Library, as a member and advisor to the UNESCO Committee and Ministry of Culture, as a philosopher and writer and academic. Now in Switzerland, at the University of Lucerne, working on his PhD, dedicated to the topic that is very intriguing, actually, and it comes to the goes to the bottom of a question: to what extent the very intimate and personal emotions related to the refugee faith and refugee life can be analyzed and can be felt. I was thinking, certain the PhD, the thesis you are working on is dedicated to the particular topic of almost auto-censorship. At least this is something that at the first glance can be read out of the abstract, but it's not exactly about auto-censorship. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, hello. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure and honor to be here at this conference with you. Before I answer, just one explanation. I'm not a doctor. Hopefully I will soon become a doctor when I defend this thesis. So, what is it about? It's about the art which is not accessible to the audience, to the public, but not because of the censorship or some repression, but by the deliberate and free will decision of the author, him or herself. Okay? So it's self-censorship is a form of censorship. It's not free will decision of the author. So this is very different. But it's, of course, connected. And, for example, in one part of this text, I'm dealing with these connections, similarities, and differences between these phenomenon like self-censorship or something which is known, especially here in Germany, as inner emigration. I don't know how you are familiar with that notion of inner emigration. It became known and publicly used and misused in years immediately after the Second World War by those writers, mainly writers who remained during the Nazi era in Germany, declaring that they lived here during this period in a state of innere emigration, which means that they spiritually were giving some kind of passive resistance, not participating in this immoral environment. But problem with this is that later on, after the war, they interpreted this type of life and intellectual activity as a resistance. In fact, during the Nazi times, it was the form of passive acceptance and compliance, and only later it was interpreted or reinterpreted as a resistance. It's something totally opposite. So it's a fake notion. It doesn't exist, something like this. And it was really difficult for me to find examples. I found more or less only one example which can morally be relevant and remain after rigorous analysis. But this problem of inner emigration and self-censorship is important because it is actual also now, not only in countries which are under direct, explicit political repression, but also in so-called free world, Western societies. There are many different forms of this inner emigration attitude towards society, towards some values, social, intellectual, moral values. And I see and I can recognize this as still a live problem.
You said that this inner immigration or auto-censorship is a topic that is present also today. Can you give us examples? I would say present some motives that could be relevant when thinking of the topic of our Congress, so scholars at risk.
Okay, I cannot give you a example which is like personal name in this and this country, because I think this is very much spread everywhere, and it's like a almost epidemic among majority, I would say, of intellectuals in academia or out of it today. They prefer, this attitude which prefers not to participate in the public sphere, not to participate in the society. They cover this attitude by, okay, I'm doing just my research, my science, and this is my contribution, but there is an assumption behind this which is deeply wrong, and this is the assumption of neutrality and objectivity. But this is an illusion, ideological illusion of neutrality, objectivity. I can give you a few examples. Most of us, without reflecting, would say that, for example, institutions are based on neutrality, or laws are based on neutrality, or the language is something which is transparent and ideologically neutral. But all of these things are not at all neutral. They are all driven by interest and ideologies and political power struggles behind. Or another example which is characteristic for our age, so-called neutrality of internet is now for us revealed as an illusion, of course. So this, for example, this notion of neutrality, transparency, and objectivity, which is used or misused many times, is also many times, unfortunately, just excuse not to face the reality and the real problems. So my research is partly dealing with this from the point of view of very concrete examples from the art world.
Exactly. This is something I wanted to ask you to tell us about in more detail, because the particular focus you put on the field that it's supposed to be exposed, the art creation, the art itself. So it seems contradictory when an artist is deciding not to expose himself or his piece of art, his artifact, to the public. Is it art anymore?
Yes, this is the beauty of my work, because it's full of these paradoxes. For example, how can I give an example of something which I cannot give an example? If it's not accessible to the audience, how can I know about it? Okay, but because they are so-called failed examples, or examples which last only for a limited period of time or a limited territory, and then they expired, or after the death of the author, it is revealed as something which was hidden and not shared. So there are many examples like this. Or, because now even more general aspect of it, because it is not accessible, what would be the most appropriate method to approach it? In my view, it is, of course, to imagine it. If it's not reachable to us, the only real way how to reach it is to imagine it. And this is why I'm using in my research also fictional examples from literature or movies of the works of art which are like that, not accessible. So all of this is showing that it's possible. And one of key arguments for this thesis is that that something which is not in our experience, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. For example, from astronomy, we all can see only the one side of the moon, you know, but this doesn't mean that this so-called dark side of the moon doesn't exist. Or there are some stars in the cosmos which are so far away from us that the light is still traveling towards us. It's not yet there, so we cannot see them. But because this we don't have it in experience, it doesn't mean that those stars doesn't exist. So I need, theoretically speaking, only one relevant example to prove the thesis. And I have more than 100 examples from all cultures all around the world and from all historic eras.
We started to speak about the scholar aspect of this auto-censorship. I was wondering what would be your comment, because the title of our conversation directly goes to Serbian experience. You were very active as a journalist, as a commentator, as an opponent during the war in the 90s. Later on, the first dissident after the assassination of the Ugričić, the president. I was thinking about what are your current reflections on this aspect of scholarly and artistic life in Balkans and in particular in Serbia.
First of all, I was surprised by your question because I expected that I should talk about my story, so-called. But now we came from the end of it, what I'm doing now, and I thank you for this opportunity. But now let me try to connect those two positions. How I came to the idea to research such a topic. The idea came during my stay and work in Serbia at that time. I realized that many times those works of art or literature which are the most valuable and most interesting and more emancipatory and most brilliant are hidden, are not in the focus of the public. They are marginalized or ignored or simply not there. And the best way many times, if you are looking for something which is relevant and important, the best way to find it is to look there where it looks that there is nothing. And this was my first hint, okay? And if something is not present in the public, there is a chance, bigger chance, that it's something which is important and relevant. So this was my first hint. And unfortunately, in societies like was the Serbia during the dictatorship of Milosevic, this paradoxal effect was really going on in very strong manner. And many artists were in this position. So the initial idea came from there. But my story starts even much earlier, because now when we introduced among each other, among the first question is, so where you are coming from? And I prefer to say that I'm not coming from Serbia, because country of my birth is something else. It is Yugoslavia, and this is the country which doesn't exist anymore. So I prefer to say that I am from nowhere, or I am from Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist. Just to give you a little anecdote, when I sometimes need to fulfill some database or a formular at the border, there is always this country of birth, place of birth, and I always put Yugoslavia because this is correct, this is true. But then they say, oh, it's not possible. And then I say, but how it's not possible? I mean, do you want me to lie? That I was born in Serbia or I was born in Montenegro, for example. By chance, I was born in something which is now called Montenegro, okay? But, so they forced me to lie. And I really have a difficulty with this. I still cannot accept this. And in general, this is about telling the truth. And this was my major problem always. I relatively very late in my life realized something about majority of people around me, that most of them are not like me. They are not interested in truth. They prefer something else. They prefer a lie. They prefer illusion. And if you tell them the truth, they are offended. And I realized that I live in a society where people are offended by truth. And it took me, maybe I was 40 or something during this catastrophic bloodshed in Yugoslavia, that I finally realized this. And this is really a terrible truth about the majority of people. I don't say all are like that, but unfortunately majority is like that. And it's not only in Balkans or in Middle East. I would dare to say that it's like that everywhere. It's only the difference is to which story or illusion people are ready to believe and follow without thinking. And this key problem is of non-thinking attitude. And this is everlasting, eternal problem. The Socrates was dealing with it in ancient Athens, and Hannah Arendt was writing about it when she was writing about Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the core reason of this evil and so-called banality of it is in core this non-thinking attitude of people. And I'm always puzzled with this, and I insist, and I'm trying. This is why I'm interested also in art, because art somehow initiates and re-enlightens our imagination and critical thinking.
I'm pointing to the current situation, asking you this question about opinion on how does it look like these days in the region you come from. Because from many reasons we can think that the situation and the general attitude had changed in nowadays Serbia, for example, a candidate to the European Union, somewhere on the way towards the European paradigm, let's say so.
It's not changed, unfortunately, at all. On the contrary, there was only one moment in the history of, in this case, Serbia, and this was the moment in 2000 when we really managed to kick out finally after 10 or more years of dictatorship when we managed to kick Milosevic out. And this was the crucial moment. And then I finally realized that people don't want to accept responsibility. They prefer to delegate the responsibility to some authority. Majority is like that. And because this was this historic moment to capture finally freedom, because we lived in Yugoslavia, there were many privileges and many good aspects of that life, especially compared to other so-called socialist countries. But it was not democratic country. So we lived this non-democracy, and then it came totalitarianism by Milosevic. And now finally there was this moment to embrace freedom. But freedom means responsibility. And people don't want this. Majority don't want this. And they are ready to submit themselves to anything. And they simply switched from one ideology to another as like an addict who switches from one type of drug to even more stronger type of drug. And this is what happened. So finally, there was this moment, and there was this one leader of Zoran Đinđić, who was philosopher himself, a student of Habermas, who became prime minister in 2000, and he was authentic reformist and really tried to introduce and transform the society. Exactly because of this, 3 years later he was killed in attentat, and all of this stopped, and this historic opportunity was dismissed. And from then on, in a very slow mode, everything is going backwards in that country, but in the region, I could say also as a whole, unfortunately. So there is no really improvement, unfortunately.
You wrote that reading is like falling in love. You also said that even further, that reading and falling in love means betrayal that needs to be done somehow. What would you recommend to read to fall in love?
Okay, I need to explain this. I like to think about fall in love in these terms, that this happens when we somehow dismiss everything that we believed in until that moment. Okay? And Romeo and Juliet are the easiest example. Okay? So coming from totally two opposite clans, and they break these so strong social rules. And writing and reading is something like that. this click in your mind has to happen. But I want to connect this obsession with books, because when this Zoran Đinđić became prime minister, he invited me to become director of National Library. We didn't say this. And I never in my life before that was thinking that I would once become director of National Library. It was, if somebody would tell me just a month before that, I wouldn't believe, of course. But it was like that. We didn't know each other personally. He knew my writing and my public activity. And before that also I worked in Soros Foundation. Today we heard about Central European University established by George Soros. And I was working there in these programs for publishing and libraries and internet and all these things. And we managed to really achieve some really good results there. And he knew about this and he invited me. And I accepted this at that historic moment. Just to give you one little example of my enthusiasm. The salary, my new salary as a director of National Library was 7 times less than my salary in Soros Foundation. Not 17 or 70% less, 7 times less. So I accepted this because I thought that this is the one lifetime opportunity to make a difference, from this position, which is in cultural sector so important and influential, to start these reforms and change everything. And as a leader in this field, we really achieved in the institution itself, in the whole librarianship sector, and in the whole culture sector, we achieved so many things which were much more better were recognized abroad than inside. And soon I became a member of many of these important international bodies and executive boards, things like that, and participating in global projects like World Digital Library or EBSCO project, which is also connected with what we are interested here now, because this was the project which enabled poor countries and developing countries to access to electronic academic resources. So because of this work, we were able to give the access to, let's say, Serbia and this region, equal access to all of these most valuable electronic journals, like in Princeton or Harvard or Oxford, those who paid millions for this acquisition of these resources. So this is just one example what we did. But the problem was that all the time this was accepted inside Serbia as like offense, not as achievement. And I was always criticized for this, instead of being respected, or I didn't do this to being respected or whatever, for glory or whatever. No, I wanted to really to contribute substantially to the transformation of the society, but this in a broader environment was not recognized. On the contrary, it was criticized. And then I came to the realization that there are differences between societies, and for me most important difference is regarding the status of knowledge, imagination, and responsibility. So you can make a catalog or types of societies based on this status of these 3 things. And in those societies where the status of responsibility, imagination, and knowledge is weak and low. What is high and strong is so-called identity. So identity is used or misused as some kind of prothese for lacking these crucial, substantial, real things. And unfortunately, Serbia was like that, society like that, and what we did from the point of view of libraries and academia and art and all of this was in fact received as a threat, not as a contribution and achievement, but as a threat. And then very early on, after the killing of Gingic, public attacks started against me, and it continued for next few years. I didn't want to stop my work. I continued like 3 years before. We were progressing, and but then slowly these attacks become more and more aggressive and nasty. And then finally, in 2012, I was attacked by the Minister of Police, who was before at Milosevic era his right hand. And unfortunately, this also shows you the trend that some person who should be in jail, in fact, became in so-called democratic Serbia, he became a Minister of Police. And he attacked me. He labeled me as a supporter of terrorism and traitor and all of this. And this campaign started and lasted next almost 3 months. I was always on these front pages, and I remember one front page when I was compared with the First and Second World War. It was said that I did a bigger damage to Serbian culture than First and Second War together. On the front page. It was like that. I mean, crazy. And I felt, wow, I'm a really powerful person, you know. But it was really dangerous because soon after this man, Minister of Police, became a prime minister. And at that moment, I realized that I have to leave. And since then, I live abroad like somebody who comes from nowhere.
At the same time, you keep fighting for or with the captive minds, yes, with your writings and you yourself. So thank you very much for this insights and sharing with us the very personal elements of your story and life, but also broadening the perspective on the challenges that are ahead of those both who travel to find peace, but also those who decided to invite and help those who need it. Both sides, yes, have a lot to face.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for your questions, but I want to ask you a question. If we have some time, and then we can maybe... can you tell us briefly, because you are coming from Poland, yeah, and we know and we are following these trends, political and cultural, in Poland. Can you tell us really what are the news from there, and how these retrograde tendencies have affected, let's say, cultural field in your country?
To be very short, as we are, I think we are in the schedule already, sorry. But thank you, and this is something I've been trying to talk about during the last 2 days with colleagues here. What I found appealing is that almost everything you have spoken about, the motives behind, the reasons why, it's so easy to fall again into this captive mind situation, are present in Poland. So the shallow process of democratization and liberalization ended up soon, and it seems that cultural field is a cultural battlefield used extensively by the powers, political powers in Poland, in order to keep the mind captive. So I don't want to get into the details because there's a lot of going on these days in Poland, on different fields, different sectors. Higher education was discussed previously in one of the panels, but also culture and human rights, as well as basics of the democracy, like separation of powers. Almost all of these pillars has been either destroyed or irreversibly changed. So in that sense, I'm not having a good news. On the other hand, there is still a civil society, organizations, and people of goodwill who actually very actively oppose to this, and people of culture, artists, are on the front line of this. So I would say that there's still a hope that after quite a long period of this backslash, there will be a slow process of rebuilding the open society. I think we believe in, all of us.
I wish you all the best.
The long march beyond us. Thank you, Sreten.
Thank you.